That was you? Okay. All right. We'll forget that for now. All right. Well, we can back it up one or to start. All right, well, welcome everybody. Hi there. All right, well, good morning. So my name is Brennan, and as some of you know, and maybe some of you are seeing me for the first time, but I teach Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, and I'm recently rejoined our staff here at FPC Marietta as a scholar in residence. So I'm happy to be here helping to teach every so often, and please feel free to be in touch and ask questions and ask for resource suggestions and things like that. I'll be around and available for consultation. So please feel free to get in touch. So I'll open us in prayer, but we're picking up with our second week of our study on miracles. So we'll kind of catch back up where we were last week and do a little bit of recap, and then we'll jump back into our material for today. So I'll open us in prayer. Gracious God, a God who is with us, a God who is here. Sometimes it's hard for us to believe that you're here, that you're with us, that you're surrounding us, that you're in us. Gracious God, give us eyes of faith to see and to hear you at work in the world around us. We believe, but help our unbelief. Help us to be in wonder, and help us to witness to your saving presence. Gracious God, amen. All right, so we are again picking up with our theme about miracles. Here, let's go to the next slide, and we'll kind of recap a bit. But just to say, the Bible is full of miracle stories. We have talked about this before. One climactic miracle story, of course, is the resurrection of Jesus. We can think of other miracle stories in the Old Testament too, before Jesus. We can think of stories in the Bible that have miracles after Jesus too, primarily in the book of Acts. Strangely enough, we'll get to this in a little bit, but Paul doesn't really emphasize miracle stories very much, although he says he did perform miracles. He does talk about witnessing them in 2 Corinthians. But for us, the reason I started last week where I was is to say that miracles, or talking about miracles, is a particularly poignant, I think for us, way of talking about God's presence and God's power. And the reason that I think it's important for us to address this today is for us to ask that question: is God still present and working in our lives, in our world, in the same way that God was present and working in the Bible? So this is kind of our big question, right? If we think about miracle stories, we read stories about Jesus healing people, about Jesus stilling the wind, walking on water. Sometimes, just to be honest, these stories feel a bit old-fashioned, perhaps. They sound like they come from another world. People claim to see things or hear things in today's world, and a lot of times I'm, at least, just to be honest, I'm pretty skeptical of hearing stories sometimes, stories of strange things happening. Perhaps we just live in a really different world. Perhaps they believed different things. We're going to talk about that some today. So let's move on. So this Charles Taylor, last week we talked a little bit about why it is that it's kind of hard for us to think and to read the Bible and to think this might be sort of the way that it actually happened. And a big part of this is that we live in a secular age. We live in a secular world. Charles Taylor is the great philosopher who is, at least to my understanding, has best kind of probed these questions of what is this world that we're living in, where did we come from? And if we go to the next slide, we live, according to Taylor, in a disenchanted world. I mean, we look at the world of the past, when we read stories from say, ancient times or from the Middle Ages, stories of gods and demons and angels and spirits kind of doing things, manifesting in the world, it seems to us a bit like reading a fairy tale or something. For us to go back into that enchanted world, for us to think really carefully, what would it have been like to be alive in Europe in, say, the year 1500? Well, the belief in the transcendent world or the spiritual world, the superhuman world, the supernatural world would have been taken for granted. Everyone believes in it. Everyone talked about it all the time as a part of their daily life. That is, demons, devils, angels, spirits, right? We're just kind of understood to infuse the world around us. And things, holy things, or sometimes evil things, would hold these powers. And the human body, too, was permeable. That is, that you couldn't keep these things out. God would possess you in a way, or demons could possess you, and that this was just understood to be a part of kind of normal life. That this conversation and this way of understanding the world was just suffused everything about the world. Now, if we go to the next slide, one of the things that shows us this is the way people responded to the Eucharist, right? The body of Christ. In the year 1500, Luther wasn't around. He was around. He wasn't yet preaching his version of the gospel yet. We hadn't had a Reformation. Everyone believed that the body of Christ, that is the Eucharist, had some kind of numinous presence to it, some sort of transcendent spiritual power to it. And as we said, remember, the priests had to convince people to take the Eucharist, not because they didn't believe it, but because they believed it was so powerful it could rip their bodies apart, right? So you had to take the Eucharist twice a year. And just to sort of compare this to our modern experience of having some bread and some juice, and no one in the pews at FPC Marietta is imagining this is going to rip their bodies apart, right? In the same way that we might say, it's a spiritual experience for me to take the Eucharist, and someone in the year 1500 might say, a spiritual experience, oh my goodness. Well, what spirit is possessing you? Or, no, not like that. No, I mean, it's really great. It's a great time for reflection. It's like reading a good poem or something, right? Just to say, this world that we live in is very different from that world of the year 1500 and before. All right, so the next slide. Also relics, the idea that things in of themselves could hold spiritual power, could possess spiritual power. That was just taken for granted in the year 1500 and before. Of course, there are some forces that start to ask some questions about this, and we call those folks the Protestant reformers. So the next slide. The cause of our secular age, the beginning at least of the cause of our secular age that we currently live in, is the Protestant Reformation. There's really no question about this. In the year 1500, everyone believes that spirits are everywhere. Everyone believes that relics have power. Everyone believes the Eucharist has some sort of numinous transcendent power. And it's the reformers that are the first people to really start asking rational questions about, does this actually have power in it? Does this bone have power in it? Does this thorn, you say, comes from the rose, the crown of thorns, does this actually have power in it? Does the Eucharist have real power in it? These are the people who start to ask these. Luther asks these questions. And skeptically, right, asking questions of the power of the church. Does the church have the power to say these things, to do these things, to proclaim these things? Are these stories of saints and relics actually true? And they start to apply what we might think of as historical criticism to these stories, to these legends. And they start to ask questions about them. And they start to say, no, probably not. And of course, the Reformed tradition itself starts to ask questions about the Eucharist. Does this actually have God's body in it? And the answer the Reformed tradition comes up with is no, not really. It's not powerful as a piece of Jesus' body. And this is a radical thing to say at the time. And it transforms the history of the world. And in many ways, it leads a lot of people, Catholics as well, to start asking questions about their own traditions and to skeptically approach their history and their theology and their rituals and their relics. And in the Catholic tradition, there's a counter-reformation where the Catholic Church undergoes a similar transformation, starting to ask questions about some of these things, starting to be skeptical of their own traditions. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that eventuates from this is that people start to continue down this road of asking rational, kind of historical questions, scientific questions, and they start to say, maybe we should just look at the world without this whole enchanted frame, right? This whole idea, that assumption that there's spiritual power in everything and that all objects have spiritual power, and maybe we should just look at the world kind of rationally. And Charles Taylor, the philosopher, has said, he calls this the immanent frame. It's kind of like a lens or a frame that we're going to put on everything, and we're going to say, we're just going to look at this and we're going to subtract out all of those assumptions. And this used to be a difficult thing to do. Scientists like Isaac Newton believed in God, of course. All the great ancient, early modern scientists all believed in God. But they would also try to ask rational questions. They would try to not assume a lot of things about the transcendent world when doing their scientific experiments. And of course, this leads to people saying, maybe we don't need that stuff at all. Maybe we can explain the whole world just through equations. So let's go to the next slide. As Charles Taylor points out, one of the results that we're currently living in our current age of the secular world, is fragilization of all belief. All beliefs, even doubt in God, becomes fragilized. And he points this out in many ways, but I think we're starting to see an increasing questioning even of the kind of rational modes of looking at the world. That is to say, we are living in an age where nobody really knows what to believe. That's not true of everyone, but it's true of most folks. If you walk through Marietta and take a survey of folks, people would be probably like, there still aren't that many people who say, I'm an atheist, right? I surely don't believe. I have proof, undeniable proof that there's no God. What most people say is, I don't really know. That is to say, the nones or the agnostics are the ones that are on the great rise. So, in any event, just in our own world, what do we do about this? All right, next slide. So I asked two questions last time. I'm going to leave us with two slightly different questions today, influenced by our work in the Bible, and that's going to be, how do we perceive, or how can we perceive the presence and activity of God in a disenchanted age? And I'm picking miracles really as just a touchstone for this, right? If we can talk about miracles today, then we could probably talk about anything transcendent, right? That is to say, how do we talk about God's presence, activity? How does God do stuff in our world? All right, next slide. And the second question is, how can we talk about the presence and activity of God in a disenchanted age? How can we witness it, perceive it, and how can we talk about it? How do we explain it? Okay, now next slide. So we are now going to move back into our work in miracles, and just to remind us, the word miracle itself in English comes from a Latin word, mirari, which means to be in wonder. We're going to ask a question about that word today. And that Latin word is derived from this Greek concept of thalma. If you've heard of thaumaturgy, that's like a very fancy sounding word that really just means doing miracles. But it comes from the Greek word thalma, which means a wonder, or a thing that makes us wonder. And that is related to the Hebrew word nifalot, which means wonders or wondrous things. So if you look in the Bible, in the Greek New Testament or in the Hebrew Old Testament, and you were to look for the word for miracle, you actually wouldn't find the Latin word, of course. You would find these Greek and Hebrew words that really mean wonder, to be in a state of wonder, things that cause you to be in a state of wonder. That's what that word miracle really means. So we're going to ask a question about that today. All right, let's go to the next slide. So just to remind us where we are in our sequence of sessions, we talked last time about that immanent frame, the secular world that we live in. We said a lot more about that, right? But I picked out some highlights. And then today we're going to talk about miracles in the Bible and the presence of God in the Bible. And then next week we're going to transition to how do we talk about this today? And then that last week we're going to share some stories, and we're going to talk with each other about this. So, in any event, we'll talk about that more next week. All right, so let's move on. All right, so miracles in the Bible. As I said, the Bible's full of miracle stories from beginning to end. We can think about these as Christians. We tend to think about these in two big categories. Category A is stuff that we just kind of all take for granted as Christians, like creation, God made the world, and then the resurrection of Jesus, the incarnation, the big ones, right? We can call that bucket A. Those are ones that most Christians can kind of talk about. And then there's like the little ones, like Moses parting the waters, or the manna, or Jesus healing someone. That is to say, these are still big things, but they're also ones that might make us think a little bit, or I don't know, we get a little antsy about these sometimes if people ask us, do you think Jesus really did that? The incarnation is kind of easier for us to talk about, or the resurrection even is a little easier sometimes for us to talk about, but like, did Jesus really heal that guy? And I know that this makes us a little queasy because a lot of Christians come up with all these explanations, like to explain it away. Like, for example, Jesus psychologically healed the person, right? Jesus kind of made them feel better about themselves, and it was a psychosomatic illness, and it went away, and so on. Or the manna in the wilderness was created by bugs that, pooped out some sort of edible substance, right? We come up with these scientific explanations for these miracles, which might actually kind of show that we need some more reassurance about these little things, right? And maybe stories about these things in our own lives make us feel a bit uncomfortable because of our imminent frame, because of the ways that we see the world. So we tend to have two explanations when it comes to miracles. Let's go to the next slide. We tend to have two explanations as Christians when it comes to miracles. And this tends to fall down the kind of conservative liberal divide, not in terms of politics, but in terms of theology. Right? On the one hand, you have a lot of Christians who say, yes, of course, these things happened, literally, as they happened, as they're written on the text. That's exactly how they happen in real life. And not only that, but they are proofs of faith. They prove Jesus. And if you don't believe it, you're being obstinate. This is a proof of faith. I mean, I heard this a lot when I was a kid in church. Jesus healed that person. That's a proof of faith. It proves that Jesus is God, and it proves that you should believe. And if you don't believe, you're being obstinate. And this is the reason these things exist, because they're proofs of faith. Well, on the other hand, next slide, we have a more skeptical take, right? And this tends to emerge in more progressive churches. That is to say, well, we don't really know that they happened exactly like that, and we don't know that they happened exactly like this today even. Maybe miracles don't really happen at all like that. That is to say, these are ancient people who have an ancient way of understanding the world. We can explain this stuff more rationally today. We have modern medicine. We have modern science. We can kind of get this stuff. But also, maybe some of these are just stories, right? Maybe they're mostly symbols. Like the resurrection of Jesus, strange credulity, right? This guy woke up and from death and then left his tomb and appeared as a disguised person to his friends and then shot up to heaven like in a rocket or something. Like behind, we got VBS next week, right? Which is why we have the rocket set behind me, right? So Jesus' ascension right here, right? Really, are we supposed to believe that? If I told you that my neighbor shot up to heaven like in a rocket, you wouldn't believe me. So why would you believe this ancient story about this, right? That is to say, maybe these stories are really just symbols, right? Jesus' resurrection is a story meant to make us feel better about our lives, right? It's a symbol of the power of life to reemerge, right? Like every spring, new life emerges. It's not actually the same life, but it's different life, but whatever, it grows back or something like that, right? Maybe this is the way. I actually worked in a church once, and so did Catherine, my wife. We were both in seminary, and we were working for a church, and on Easter Sunday, we heard the sermon literally started, Jesus' body rotted away in a tomb like any other pauper's body, but the story is significant. And Catherine and I both looked at each other like, okay. So this really happens, it's really out there, right? So maybe that's what it is, or maybe these miracle stories are just ancient people trying to give us kind of stories to help us understand who Jesus was, right? They're not really meant for us to believe these things happen. They're meant to give us a kind of a symbolic way of understanding who he was and what he meant to them. Or maybe these are moral examples, right? Like the crossing of the Red Sea, that's about how we shouldn't oppress people, and oppression is bad. Or maybe the feeding of the 5,000. Maybe it's saying feeding hungry people is a good thing. It's a thing God wants us to do. That's what some people kind of take from these. That's what makes them significant. And notice what these folks are doing. What they're doing is they're taking these ancient stories and they're trying to make them significant to their own contemporary life. And you know what? Jesus does this with his miracles. This is actually what Jesus does in John 6. In John 6, Jesus does the miracle of feeding, but then he stops and he preaches a sermon. And he doesn't say in John chapter 6, this is proof that I'm God. What he says is, you saw how I fed people here. Well, this is kind of a symbol of my body, and I'm giving my body for you. And this is so that you can live on and help people after me and so on, right? This is Jesus' kind of sermon about the bread. And he says, I am the bread of life in that sermon. That's where he says that in John 6. And so Jesus does this himself with his own miracles, sees them as symbols to help people in their kind of day-to-day life. So maybe they are kind of about our faith, at least in some way. So let's go to the next slide. There's the fluke, so each of these explanations, I think, leaves something out. The first explanation, right, the one that just says these are just ancient stories that are true, literally true, but they're really just about what happened then to prove that Jesus is God. End of story. What they leave out, I think, is that doesn't make these things mean anything to me now. These miracle stories, when I read them in the Bible, if that's all they are, is just ancient kind of magic tricks to prove that Jesus is God, then why do I read them? Well, the second kind of way of thinking about this, I guess, is that maybe it doesn't matter that they happen so much as they matter to me. That is to say, the folks who say, well, Jesus' body rotted away, but the resurrection means something to me kind of poetically as a story. What those folks might be missing out is something important about the biblical faith, which is that like this stuff actually mattered to those people back then in the stories. The people in the stories don't just, the miracle happens and they say, oh, great, this means something to me personally. No, they say this means something for the whole world, and they go tell other people about it. So maybe we need kind of both of these perspectives in a way, but in a nuanced way. I'll explain this more in a moment. Like to the first version, to the folks who think miracle stories are just kind of proofs of what God has been doing in the past, maybe biblical faith is more than just ancient history. Maybe these are actually trying to make moral points or symbolic points about what life is really like and calling us to our own faith, getting us to think about today. And also to that first way of thinking about miracles, that they're just proofs. I would say this, I don't think miracles prove anything. Sorry, even modern miracles, they don't prove anything specific. So just think about it. You see something crazy happen, like I levitate for a moment or something, whatever. Let's say, or my body starts to glow transcendently, right? Let's say that starts to happen. What does it mean? Or let's say I heal someone in front of you. What does it mean? Well, we can come up with lots of things that it means, but does it mean that Jesus Christ is Lord? Not necessarily. How many people in the Bible witnessed Jesus' miraculous acts and didn't really believe, or maybe they believed he was special, he was a magician, he was a healer, he was important, but they didn't come to the biblical faith. That is to say, they didn't end up saying Jesus is Lord. There are lots of people. The disciples who were with him for years abandoned Jesus at the cross because they didn't quite believe. And they saw how many miracles, right? According to the Bible, lots, right? So that is to say, miracles don't generate faith in and of themselves, and they don't have a very clear message in and of themselves. When a miraculous act happens in the Bible, people don't just all of a sudden get everything there is to know about Jesus. They don't prove the faith. The Nicene Creed doesn't pour out of people's mouths once the miracles happen. They often are amazed and don't understand, the Bible tells us. They often don't get it. So that is to say, there's something more to it than just that first view that says that, well, the miracles happen, that proves my faith. They actually need interpretation. Was Jesus a doctor? We could come up with a million different ways to rationalize what happened. And people in these ancient stories often do rationalize what happens. That is to say, they don't fully believe. When the waters part and Moses parts the waters, Pharaoh follows Moses into the waters. Pharaoh doesn't get it. That is to say, a lot of people don't get these things. So, to the second point, though, to the second way of perspective, the way of saying maybe these are just symbols and so on, we can also say, is it true that the resurrection is just a poem, or that Jesus healing these people is just supposed to kind of make us understand vaguely that God cares about, healing or something? A purely abstract God, I would argue, doesn't do much for us. But I would say in our world today, in our secular world, we've kind of cut the edges of God away in many ways, like to kind of, God bless America, like this kind of vague notion of a God that works vaguely through history, but any specific thing that you'd say sounds a bit uncomfortable, makes us feel a bit uncomfortable. This purely abstract God, though, I don't think matters much to us. The God of the Bible and the God of Christian faith is a God of concrete action in history, in space and time. And I think that's symbolized most fully through the incarnation, that God became bone and flesh, and not bone and flesh all the time, in one very specific place and time, and did very specific things in that place and time. And that's why, for the rest of history, at least Christians are going to care about first century Palestine. We're going to care deeply about the internal politics of first century, a very unimportant place in time historically. Let me tell you, ancient Roman historians don't focus a lot on Palestine. It's a backwater, right? It's a very minor part of what was happening in the power politics of the world of that day and age. But we're going to care about that specific time and place because for us, that specific time and place, those specific people, those specific stories tell us something about the God who created the universe. That to me is kind of the core of the Christian message. And if you want to think more about this kind of claim of the miracle of the incarnation and why we have a historical faith in some ways at least, That'll be the topic of our meetings in December when we talk during Advent. We'll talk about the incarnation. What does it mean that Jesus became flesh and bone? That God has one very specific set of fingernails that are God's. God has hair, like not all of our hair. God has one specific set of hair. God has 10 fingers, and only 10. That is to say, very strange when we start to think about the incarnation. So we'll talk about that more later. But one thing to point out too, go to the next slide, is that these ancient authors, just to recognize this, are not like us. They're like us in lots of ways, but not always. If you talk to someone from a foreign culture, there's some translation work that you have to do to be able to make things make sense to them. There are different assumptions. There are different lenses that people use to see the world. And folks who lived in ancient Israel were very different from us. They did have different assumptions about even science, right? They didn't have a science per se. So I have this theological assumption. This is like my assumption about God. I assume that God speaks to people in ways they can understand. And I also assume that human beings have limited capacities. My brain is limited. I don't speak all languages. I don't speak all cultures. If God's going to communicate with me, it's going to be in my culture, in my language, in ways I can understand. And if God's going to communicate with ancient Palestinian people, it's going to be in a very different way, right? Just like if God's going to speak to modern people who live in a different culture, it's going to be very different than how God would speak to me. How does God communicate to people? I would say God communicates in ways people understand. This is kind of an incarnational understanding of God. God's going to speak through very specific times and places and languages. And the undeniable historical fact is that ancient Israel, including the time of Jesus, was a part of the culture of the ancient Near East. You can also include the Mediterranean vaguely, so Greece and Rome a little bit, but mostly it's like Egypt and Babylon and the Canaanites, right? These are the folks, this is the culture in which Israel is distinctively a part. And so my working proposal is if we understand Israel's writings as God's communication to an ancient Near Eastern people, it will help us interpret the Bible. So we can't import modern understandings of science or our modern secular frame, right? Like back into these ancient texts and start to read them as if ancient people understood Jesus was a therapist primarily. I do think Jesus did some things that were a lot like therapy. At the same time, I don't think that's only what Jesus does. So in other words, if we try to hear these stories within their ancient culture, and I think in some ways that does mean suspending our disbelief, because in those ancient people's culture, they believed that God's spirits were all over the place, and evil spirits too. That is to say, this might help us to understand these folks and their stories a bit more. All right, let's go to the next slide. Just to show you that culture, that cultural context is this area, the Fertile Crescent, some folk call it. But from Egypt all the way to Babylon, and including a little bit of Greece and Rome. I say a little bit because the Greek and Roman culture is a little less distinctive in the biblical witness, especially in the Old Testament. All right, next slide. So, we live in this different culture, our modern culture. But one of the things we can do when we look at these ancient biblical texts and try to see them in their ancient context is that we can say miracles aren't just odd events. So sometimes people say, well, it was a miracle, or maybe it was like a miracle when I passed my exam or something, and maybe they really do mean it, maybe they don't, right? This is to say, we can just say it's a surprising thing. It's just an odd thing that happens. And when we look at the biblical texts, we can see it doesn't just mean a surprising event. Nobody looks at Jesus' miracles and says, wow, that's surprising, and then walks away. These folks say things like, well, according to the Gospel of Mark chapter 2, after miracles, they were all amazed and they glorified God. So if something crazy happens in your life and you say, wow, it's a surprise, what a surprise, that's a little different thing than saying thanks be to God. And perhaps now we say thank goodness as like our little kind of secularized way of saying thank God, right? Thank goodness. But in any event, we say kind of these ideas, right? So in the Bible, these things are not called miracles in the way we think of them. They use these Greek and Hebrew words for wonder, to cause a state of wonder. And wonder doesn't just mean wow. Wonder means I wonder what's going on here. I wonder what's behind this. I wonder who did this. That's really the basic question that these miracle stories get us to ask. To be amazed is one thing, but to really think who did this and why is the deeper point of the miracle stories. And in these stories, it's only faith. Faith is the thing that gives people the ability to understand these stories, and they talk to each other about it through the lens of faith. And it's an intentional thing. People in the biblical stories often don't believe after the miracle. The miracle doesn't cause belief. Belief causes people to interpret the miracles as God's activity in the world. So I just want to make this very clear. We often look at the biblical text and say, well, they lived in a different time and age. They lived in a time when miracles happened all the time. You read the book of Acts and it's miracles from beginning to end. If I lived in a world like that, of course I would believe when I saw a miracle. Of course I believe in God. Of course it'd be easy to believe in God. It's hard to believe in God today because we don't see this stuff all the time. Well, the book of Acts is about a 70-year span of time. 50-year span of time. That is to say, the book of Acts is a highlight reel of all the miracles. Most of the time in the book of Acts, it's just Paul sitting on a boat, baking in the sun, right? Sleeping, eating, just sitting there, looking at the ocean, right? That's most of the time. It's elapsed, right? Elapsed footage. It's like you're watching a football game, and if you ever go to a football game in person, most of the time you're sitting around. There's 35 seconds of action in a football game, for real. You watch the highlights on ESPN and you're like, wow, this game is awesome. And then you go to it in person and you're like, oh, wow, I could take a nap right now, right? That is to say, you're looking at a highlight reel of miracles in Acts. Most of the time, these people don't see this stuff. Ancient people didn't walk around seeing these things all the time. It was amazing to them. But for us to say, we look at these folks and we say, of course they had faith. They saw this stuff all the time. Maybe we're seeing some of this stuff all the time too. And maybe for us, it's just like them. Maybe most of us don't believe, just like a lot of them don't believe. It's not that these folks didn't believe that there were gods active in the world. It's just they didn't necessarily believe it was the God of Israel doing this stuff. They had their questions, their suspicions. Some people see Jesus do miracles in the Gospels, and you know what they say? They say, it's by Beelzebul that you're doing this. They don't necessarily believe it's the God of Israel. So the faith comes before interpreting the miracle, not after it. So the other thing to say is that faith gives people the ability to understand the who and why that we wonder with when we see this act of God in the world. All right, next slide. The second thing to say is that witness is the second part of this story. People can be amazed at magic tricks, but they don't think anything of it necessarily. But in the Bible, people, after seeing a miracle, who have faith before it, really, they end up saying, wow, this means something to me. And then they go and they tell people about it. So in Mark 5, the story of the demoniac, the Gerasene demon, this guy who has legion in him, and Jesus casts out the wild spirits and so on. The guy then goes and tells everyone about Jesus. And Jesus even tells him, man, go tell people about this stuff. He wants to go with Jesus. And Jesus says, no, your job is to go tell people about it. That is the witness, to witness. Not just to see witness, but to witness, to talk about the thing that you've seen. That's actually the most important part of these miracle stories. The fishermen who witness a miracle haul of fish, they're told, hey, go witness, go tell people about this stuff. So the wonder and witness. Let's go to the next slide here. Wonder and witness. These are the two dimensions of biblical miracles. And the miracles, like I said, don't generate faith. They presume it. And these separate these miracles from amazing occurrences or unexplained phenomena. When I talk about miracles, sometimes people are like, what, do you believe in Bigfoot too? No, sorry, I'm a Bigfoot atheist. I don't think Bigfoot exists. I don't see a lot of evidence for it. But for me, this wonder and then witness, who is doing this and why? That's actually the important part. So let's go to the next slide. So like I said, the miracles, they often don't fit very well in our world, right? Our current world. To put it kind of bluntly, we live in a universe right now that's explained by laws of science, right? Like gravity, right? We know that gravity exists, right? We have this, we can actually chart it out. There's an equation for gravity. They're developing the quantum equation for gravity right now, right? Well, we talk about gravity operating in different dimensions. Like, there's a lot of knowledge out there about how the world works. And for us, often, it works as this kind of like clock, right? It's like built, right? It works, it just does its own thing. It operates according to a logic that's internal to the mechanism of the world itself. And that's opposed to an ancient view that is creation. That is that God made this thing and God's in it and God's with it, God's doing stuff with it all the time. That's a very different way of seeing the world. Our universe, we say, operates according to natural principles that are repeatable, that are reliable. This is why you get in an airplane and you don't, some people pray every time they get in an airplane, but lots of people don't, right? They just kind of trust that the principles of Bernoulli's aerodynamic principles are going to lift this thing up off the ground and it's going to work. And you know what? It does, right? Miraculously, right? But not really, right? It's just following a law of science. And this, of course, helps us to think of that idea, right? If we see a miracle, then it's a law of nature being broken. And of course, laws of nature don't get broken, or else you wouldn't drive in a car or fly in a plane, right? If you believe that all the time laws of nature didn't really work. No, they do. So our whole world is based on us thinking these things are reliable principles. So maybe ancient people just didn't understand nature as good as we do. Maybe that's what, they're just like seeing stuff and not understanding it, and they're explaining it through these bizarre, you've heard of this stuff like ancient gods are invented to explain natural phenomena people couldn't understand, like Zeus explains volcanoes and things like this, right? Well, actually, I think this is not the way that we even talk about nature today. Let's go to that next slide. The laws of nature are not like traffic signs, right? You blow past a red light and you get arrested for breaking the law, whatever, or, fined, whatever, But you break a law, a policeman comes and says you broke the law, and they enforce the law in some way, right? But this is not at all what we mean when we talk about the laws of nature. Laws of nature don't work like this. No, the laws of nature are human hypotheses that attempt to predict how things will probably behave. So if you break the law of nature, sorry, that means the law of nature wasn't right. So if you break the speeding law, that doesn't mean that you're right, right? But if you witness something that breaks a law of nature, then you have to revise your laws of nature. That's the whole way that science works, right? So these laws aren't enforced or enforceable. The laws are descriptive. They describe how the universe actually works to help us predict how future events will work. The laws of nature don't try to keep rogue elements, in check or something like that. So if something happens to break the laws of nature, scientists ask, I want to observe this. Can I observe this? How do I observe this? And how do I use these events to revise my assumptions about how the laws of nature work? So you can work out gravity on Earth, right, really easily, but then you go into outer space and your laws about gravity go away, and in some way or they change. And so, of course, you have to revise your laws of gravity. And then you witness the fact that, planets bend light, or stars bend other stars' light in the galaxy, Einstein's way of looking at gravity, and you say, well, actually, we've got to revise our laws of gravity. Gravity works differently than we think it did, than Isaac Newton thought, right? We're revising these laws. And then, of course, you discover quantum mechanics, and now quantum physics, and now you have to revise the laws of gravity yet again. That's just how science works, right? And as scientists know, nature actually does change over time. That is to say, the climactic predictions we can make today about what it's like to live in Georgia, and the farmer's almanac predicting the weather for the next year and things like this. This is based on repeatable phenomena, but over time, those weather patterns change. Stuff does change, actually, on Earth. And so if we think about this, this way of thinking about the laws of nature, they're not laws, that's just the way that nature works. And if we imagine, perhaps, that God actually created the world, God can change the phenomena of something if God wants to, in the same way that your front yard doesn't look the way it is in a state of nature just because it always is going to be like that. You keep it looking like that. You're active and involved in the way your front yard looks. My front yard doesn't look great right now. We got to do some work to it. But right now it's kind of state of nature is taken over in a way. But if I trim the hedges, I've just interrupted a pattern of nature. I've changed the shape of the pattern of nature. And we can say, how could it be if we believe that God created this world and also created it to operate according to certain principles? Seems like it's not a far stretch to me to imagine that God might sometimes intervene and change those principles, just like I do all the time with stuff that I make. So all to say that this sense that God can change the patterns of the world. God can act in the world. Whether God does or not, that's another question. But all to say, it's not out of the realm of explanation. Science doesn't rule this out, in other words. These individual moments of God inexplicably changing something, of course that's possible. It doesn't follow the rules of science, and so scientists will say it's not possible. But the question is possible and probable are two different issues. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So miracles also aren't self-explanatory, like I said. They don't necessarily mean something. The people who witness these things have to actually give the meaning to them. And this happens in the Bible. People give different meanings. Remember, Jesus says, who do people say that I am based on my works? And some people say you're Elijah. Some people say you're John the Baptist. Others say you're the Christ. People see this stuff happen, and they come up with different explanations for it. And so the issue is that miracles can be explained different ways. And you might be able to explain them in scientific ways. That is to say, is it possible to say that some of the visions that people have, like Julian of Norwich's visions, is it possible to say that those are induced by some sort of psychosis, or that she had some sort of psychological issue, or that she was deficient in some mineral, or that her neurons were firing in a certain way? Yeah, perhaps. That very well might be explainable. We can explain perhaps some of these miracles of Jesus through better knowledge of science. It's possible. I don't want to rule that out. But would explaining it that way also take away the idea that Jesus did this thing and that Jesus was trying to make a point through this? So all to say, whether we explain these things by science or whether we don't explain these things by science, that seems to be kind of beside the point in a way. Jesus is trying to do these things to make a statement. So people have to interpret the miracles, and you have to add the meaning that this comes from God. That's not like, even if God rearranged the stars in the sky to say, hey, I'm God, there might be a way to explain that scientifically. There might be. That is to say, we can always explain these things away. What we need to talk about miracles is the sense of meaning, but also of community discernment. We need to talk about these things as a community. What do we think about these? What are they trying to say to us? What's the statement? Okay, let's move to the actual Bible. Let's go to the next slide here. All right. So, I like this little picture of a baby here. The Bible, again, doesn't say that these things are proofs for Jesus. It's supposed to be proving to people who don't believe, to force belief on them. Jesus, in fact, rejects this. Remember the temptation stories of Jesus in Matthew 4 and in Luke 4, where the devil says, hey, throw yourself off this building. And Jesus says, no, I'm not going to do a trick to make people believe. That's not the point of what I'm doing. So perhaps we could say when a person of faith sees a miracle, they don't see anything different than what other people see. What they do is they see something more in what they see than what other people see. They see something more in that. And this can maybe help us to see miracles not just as like things that are beyond explanation, but things that require more explanation, even little things in our lives. Can we perceive God as being active in these events? So next slide. Oh yeah, okay, so, let's go back a couple. I think there's like some paint. Is there a picture of paint before this? No, never mind. Let's go. Yeah, let's just go ahead. That's okay. Let's go back to the miracles. Okay, next slide. All right, there you go. Okay, great. All right, so... the picture of paint splatters is just to say, if you see paint splatters on the floor, you might kind of imagine someone splattered paint on the floor or something like that. But if you see, the Mona Lisa painted on your wall, you might say, who did this and why? Okay, but so in the Bible, if we look at the Bible, Old Testament and New, miracles tend to follow a similar pattern. Now, you can find individual miracle stories that break this pattern in some way, but generally speaking, there's this kind of pattern to this. That is, the first thing that happens in these miracle stories is that people often experience a problem and they want a solution. Sometimes they cry out. So the ancient Israelites, so if you look at like Exodus 2, I'll just turn to Exodus 2 for a moment. So in the beginning of Exodus, right, the Israelites are enslaved, and at the end of Exodus chapter 2, after a long time, this is verse 23 of Exodus 2, after a long time the king of Egypt died, the Israelites groaned out under slavery, they cried out to God. Out of their slavery, they cried out, and the cry for help rose up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God noticed the Israelites. And then the next story, of course, is Moses and the burning bush. That is to say, God sees or hears a cry. And this happens in the New Testament too. Jesus is often responding to a cry. The woman with the bleeding who ends up trying, she wants a solution to her problem. Or Jairus, his daughter dies, and he comes and grabs Jesus and sends a messenger, hey, come on, help me. Right? That is to say, people reach out for Jesus. And my point is that this presumes some sort of faith. That is to say, these things, Jesus doesn't walk around forcing miracles on people and saying, boom, wah, wah, check it out, right? Downtown Square, Marietta, magic show, like believe in God, right? Those things don't work. Jesus doesn't want us to do those sorts of things. These things actually come to people who already have some understanding of God and who reach out. And then this unusual event happens, and then people observe that event in stunned wonder. And this is often a part of these miracle stories. Moses says, what is this great sight that I should see it, that I should turn aside? Wait, what is happening here? I don't understand this, right? There's this moment of wonder. And people then, at the end of the story, explain the event, and often explain the event to others or in community. They explain this event in terms of God activity, and they witness to God's activity and God's power in the world. And this is how these miracle stories actually work in the Bible. All right, next slide. So in the Old Testament, I could look at Exodus 2 and 3, which I just looked at, but also let me take a look at a couple of Old Testament miracle stories. A lot of these, if you're going to think about an Old Testament character who does miracles, Moses is one. Can you think of any others that are known for doing miracles? Elijah and Elisha, right? This is like our big ones, right? So let me turn to 1 Kings 17. So 1 Kings 17 is the introduction of Elijah when he busts onto the scene, and he does a bunch of miracles all of a sudden. And in 1 Kings 17, in verse 8, the word of the Lord came to Elijah saying, "Go down to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and live there, a foreign place, for I have commanded a widow there to feed you." So there's a vulnerable person who's going to take care of Elijah. And so he sets out and he goes to Zarephath in Sidon, a foreign place. When he came to the gate of the town, a widow was there gathering sticks, and he called her and he said, "Hey, can you bring me a little bit of water?" And then she goes to bring it, and he says, "Hey, can you give me a little bit of bread too? I'm hungry." But she says, "As the Lord, as Yahweh your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of meal in a jar, a little oil in a jug. I'm now gathering some sticks so that I can go home and prepare a meal for myself and my son so we can eat it and then die." Last meal. We're about to have our last meal. That's it. We've got no food left. We're going to eat the last little bit we have, and then we're just going to sit down and die during this famine that's happening in this land. And then Elijah says, "Do not be afraid," which is the beginning of an oracle of salvation. God's about to do something. Whenever you see that in the Bible, do not be afraid. It doesn't mean never be afraid. Being afraid of things happens in the Bible all the time. It's an important thing to be afraid, but here, now, this is what this means. Now you don't need to be afraid. Do not be afraid. Go and do as you have said. But first, make me a little cake and bring it to me. And afterwards make something for yourself and your son. For thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, the jar of meal will not be emptied, and the jug of oil will not fail until the day, and so on. So that is to say, you're going to have enough food. And she goes and she does what he says, and she has enough food. And then verse 17, after this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill. This widow, her son, gets sick after the miracle of provision of food that God brings. And then she says to Elijah, "What do you have against me, O man of God? Have you come to bring my sin to remembrance, to cause the death of my son? You judging me? Is this judgment? What did you come here to do?" And notice that this is her crying out. She wants a solution. And she's saying it angrily at Elijah. And Elijah doesn't respond by saying, "How dare you say this to me?" or "God doesn't take this stuff." Yelling at God is often a great way to get a miracle. So, not kidding. She yells at God and demands that God do something. Is this what you're about? You're about coming here just judging me and making me feel bad for myself? Is that what you're all about? Or is there something more, maybe? And Elijah responds by saying, "Give me your son." And he goes up and he brings him upstairs. And then Elijah, cries out to Yahweh and says, "Yahweh, my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I'm staying by killing your son?" Elijah says, "How dare you, God? How dare," I mean, really, in Hebrew, this is like it's impertinent. Like, this is rude. He's speaking rudely to God. "How dare you do this, God? Are you really going to do this?" And then he says, "Oh, Lord, my God, let this child's life come into him again," which is translated to be kind of nice, but really in Hebrew, this is a command. Elijah demands. This is an order, an imperative. Like, pick up your clothes, right? To your kids with their room, right? No, yeah. Put this kid's life back in him again, Elijah says. And it says, Yahweh listened to the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child came into him, and he revived. Elijah took the child, brought him in the upper chamber, and said, "See, your son's alive." And then the woman at the end, that point 4, she says, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of Yahweh in your mouth is truth." She begins to say, now I really understand. She believed a little bit before. She helps this guy at the very beginning, and she says, "As Yahweh your God," right? She's talking about God a little bit. She has some faith. Maybe it's not all there, but at the end of the story, she says, "Okay, now I know. Now I know for sure, and now I'm going to tell other people about this." We can also see 2 Kings 4. This is a kind of part of a great string of miracles that Elisha does. Elisha, who follows after Elijah. I don't know if that story about Elijah, miraculous feeding, healing, resuscitation of a dead person, I don't know if that struck any chords here, but this one might. In chapter 4, there's a bunch of different miracles that Elisha does, but here's one, very end. Verse 42 of chapter 4 of 2 Kings. A man came from Baal-Shalishah bringing food from the first fruits to the man of God, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha said, give it to all these people to eat. But his servant said, well, how can I settle this food before 100 people? So he repeated, well, give it to the people and let them eat, for thus says Yahweh, they will eat and have left. So he set it before them and they ate, and then they actually had some left, according to the word of Yahweh. Y'all heard a story like that before? Yeah, right. Yeah, notice these stories get repeated in the New Testament. Now, really important point about this, Jesus, his miracles are not divine. That people have this idea that like Jesus' miracles show his divinity, and then like, you know, his human part is like the human part, like he doesn't know things, that's the human part, and like he does miraculous things, that's the divine part. Is Elisha divine? Is Elijah divine? Are they God? No, they're not God. They're just people. Notice that this is just people. The just people part of Jesus does the miracles. We'll get to this more in December. That is to say, the God part of Jesus is maybe different. But Elisha and Elijah and Moses, people do these things. And here, Elisha does these things that Jesus does. A little bit better, right? Jesus does a little more. Jesus kind of shows him up a bit, right? 5,000 people instead of 100. But the feeding of the loaves and fish, it's repeating something. It's repeating these stories. And notice what these stories are all about. These events in the Old Testament are all about salvation, right? Saving people who are dying or who are vulnerable and who are about to die, like the saving at the Red Sea, the parting of the water. It's to save people. It's to feed them. It's to heal them. It's to resuscitate them. These things, protection, miracles of protecting them from harm, these are all about something. And they're all really about God's power over life and the desire for blessing, the blessing of people, showing us something about who God is. That's the point of these things. And also there are people in the Old Testament who die and who don't get healed and don't get miraculous. Did they not have faith? That's a question that we sometimes have. Did they just not have enough faith? Did they not pray enough? Is that why this happened to them? Did God not heal them because of a lack of something? And there are lots of faithful people in the Old Testament who just die. That is to say that the lack of a miracle does not say anything about the person, the individual, etc. The point is not to fix everything that's wrong or to fix everybody who's sick. That's never the point of these things. If the point was to fix everyone who's sick, then like God turns into this like magic show or something like that, right? Kind of like a prosperity gospel version of Jesus. Jesus came to make you rich and happy and healthy and wealthy and no, obviously God doesn't do that because Paul dies, right? And Jesus is crucified and dies, tortured to death, right? That is to say that this is a part of the Christian story too. God doesn't just always swoop in and save. So when God does swoop in and save, it's not a comment on us. It's a comment on trying to get us to interpret and understand who God is, to witness to the living God, who is the God in life and in death, who is the God who has the power over all. And we can't tell sometimes why God saves some and not others. But nonetheless, this witnessing to God's power is a part of our journey, a part of our job. Okay, so next slide. Okay, that's Old Testament. Here's an Ethiopian image of the burning bush. But let's go to the New Testament here. So next slide. All right, so in the New Testament, we can see that many of these miracles, like I said, actually repeat the miracles of the Old Testament. Jesus resuscitates people. That happens in the Old Testament too. Jesus has miracles over water, walking on water and things. That happens in the Old Testament too, many times actually, that God has power over water in Moses' story, but also in Elijah and Elisha's story. That is to say that all of these things have similar themes about life, about God being the power over life. There's one big difference though. Here, let's go to the next slide. In the Old Testament, you won't find any demonic possession stories. Just don't exist. Now, there's a bigger reason for this, why the Old Testament doesn't really talk about demons or demonic possession very much at all. There's a larger historical question here, which I don't have time to get into now, but just take it for granted. Old Testament doesn't really talk about this stuff, people being possessed and needing demons cast out of them. But in the New Testament, this is an assumption, at least an assumption by some people. Jesus is clearly seen by many in the New Testament community as an exorcist. That's like a primary piece of his identity. In Jesus' day, lots of people believed in demons. Suffice it to say that in the Old Testament, they don't seem to talk about this stuff very much, but by the time of Jesus, they're talking about, at least some people are talking about demons a lot, but it's not everyone. There's a big group in Jesus' day, the Sadducees, and they don't believe in resurrection. They don't really believe much in an afterlife, and they also don't believe in demons. They don't believe in these evil spirits things, right? This is a big group in Jesus' day that don't believe in evil spirits. And then there's a big group that do. That's the Pharisees. And also the Essenes, people like John the Baptist. And Jesus would have been in the camp of the Pharisees and Essenes. I know Jesus gets mad at the Pharisees and yells at them. It's because they're the closest to him. It's like yelling at your brothers and sisters. That's to say, the Sadducees, Jesus never talks much about because he's so different from them. But the Pharisees, he's trying to get them onto his side, so he's yelling at them because he's one of them, really. Remember, Paul calls himself a Pharisee as well. Pharisees were folks that were lay folks, walked around in the community, tried to teach people about God, and also tried to get them to believe in an afterlife, get them to believe in God's power to be in a part of your daily life, even to believe in things like miracles and demons. So in Jesus' day, these folks, these Pharisees and Essenes, like Jesus, believed in these stories of demons. And we're going to get next week to kind of what can we do today with these things, with these stories about demons. But just to look at these stories in Jesus' day, these are so important, and this is like kind of crucial to who Jesus is. Just really quick, if we take a look at the Gospel of Mark, I know we're coming up on our time. Mark starts with this kind of spiritual battle. Jesus goes out into the wilderness and is tested by these by Satan, by spiritual forces and so on. We could talk about that more in the time of Lent when we meet again. But Jesus comes along. He ends up kind of meeting this guy at the synagogue. And in verse 21, they come to Capernaum, Jesus and his friends, and he comes to a synagogue and he teaches, and they were astounded at his teaching. And then verse 23, there was a man in the synagogue with an unclean spirit, with some sort of evil power in him, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing and crying with a loud voice, came out of him, and everyone was amazed. There's that word for wonder. And they kept on asking one another, "What is this?" A new teaching with authority. He commands unclean spirits and they obey him. This is that community discernment part. What's happening here? And at once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. There's the witness. People begin to talk about him and what he's doing. And we can look at all these other stories of Mark that follow this. One of the most important ones for biblical scholars is Mark 5, the Gerasene demoniac, this crazy guy living out in the tombs. He's isolated from other folks, and he's screaming and yelling all the time and hurting himself. And Jesus calls the spirit out of him, and it runs into the pigs, and they run off the cliff, right? And after that, Jesus tells this guy, the guy says, I want to be with you. In verse 19 of Mark 5, Jesus refuses and says to this guy, "Go home with your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis, the 10 cities, how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was in wonder. Everyone was amazed. So the story of it is spreading the wonder as well. Okay, so in these demon stories, which are unique to Jesus in the Gospels, this is the thing he does that no one does in the Old Testament, right? The demonic is this kind of, in all these stories, it's a force beyond human control. It's this thing that people can't control. And it's not the fault of the individual. In none of these stories did Jesus say, "You probably didn't pray enough, you weren't good enough, you deserve this." It's just something happens where the people are possessed. And Jesus deals with this demonic force, not with the person. Jesus never says you should have gotten more faith or buck up or take a pill, right? He says, you need, Jesus talks to the evil power that has power over this person's life. And the second thing about these stories is that they're all hurtful. The person is hurt. They hurt themselves, sometimes others, but usually they themselves are the focus of the hurt. And the third thing is they're isolated. The people are hurt, and then they also are socially isolated. They go out to the tombs and they live among them and so on. And lastly, there's some sort of struggle, a power struggle between God and this power of evil that has taken over this person's life, that is hurting them and then it's isolating them. And these different kind of strands of these stories come together. So that is to say, next week, I'm setting up what we'll talk about next week a little bit. How do we understand these stories in our modern world? Do we have to go around cursing demons in every bush we see? Or how might we talk about this in our own day and age? But just to notice, Jesus talks to these evil powers. Jesus notices that they are hurting this person, that they are isolating this person, and these stories are all about Jesus reconnecting this person to other people. The Gerasene demoniac goes home to his family, and reconnecting this person to God, and reconnecting this person in a way to themselves, and removing the source of hurt. And that this is a demonstration of God's power in the world. Just giving you a sense. What are some stories that we can talk about that demonstrate God's power in our world today and in our lives. And lastly, this next slide, the resurrection. This is that central miracle of the Christian faith, which in my argument brings together, it's not separate, it's not in a different bucket. It brings together all of these stories. This is God's power over life itself. This is God's power over death. This is Jesus' lordship over everything in the world, the central miracle. And we'll talk more about this next week. But the main theme of today is to say, for all of these things, there could have been people who saw all of these events and who walked away and thought, neat magic trick, or I don't get it. And we know, in fact, in the Gospels, there are people who said both of those things. To interpret miracles, we need, number one, eyes of faith. And two, we need to talk about them with each other to help each other interpret these stories and to give a meaning to them. And I want to end with these two questions. So just to change the questions a little bit from last week, just to give us different thoughts. When we see amazing things, do we interpret them as prompts to wonder about God's presence and activity? Even little amazing things. And then the next question, when we experience wonders, do they provoke us to witness aloud to God's life-giving presence in the world? Do we see God active in these little things of our lives? That's what we'll come to next week, and we'll talk a little bit about how we might do this in our own day and age. And then again, that last week, we're going to talk a little about our own lives and see if we're bold enough to share some of our own stories with each other. All right, I'll stay after for questions. I know we got worship coming up, but thank you for sticking with me, and I'll see you all next week. Peace.